The cold in the dead zone was not merely a drop in temperature. It was a living, malicious entity. It possessed teeth, invisible and razor-sharp, that gnawed through the threadbare wool of Alara's cloak and sank deep into her marrow. Every step she took through the knee-deep drifts was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, a mournful dirge that sounded suspiciously like the wailing of all the wolves who had died out here, forgotten and unburied. Alara paused, leaning her small frame against the frozen trunk of a pine tree to catch her breath. Her lungs burned with every inhalation of the icy air, a stinging reminder of her own fragility. She pulled the tattered edges of her scarf higher, covering her nose, trying to preserve the precious little warmth remaining in her body. Even through the layers of wool and grime, she could smell herself, that cursed, sickly sweet scent that had ruined her life before it had even truly begun. They called her the Bleeding Runt. It was a cruel name, stripped of all humanity, but in the gray moon pack, names were earned by strength, and Alara possessed none. She was an omega of the lowest order, a creature born with a defect so dangerous it was considered a blight upon the packlands. Her blood did not clot. A simple paper cut could bleed for days. A bruise could turn into an internal hemorrhage that would leave her bedridden for weeks. But the physical weakness was not the reason for her exile to the outskirts of the territory. It was the smell. Alara's blood smelled like ambrosia. It smelled like the sweetest spring nectar, like pure, concentrated desire. To a shifted wolf, the scent of her blood was a drug, an overwhelming aphrodisiac that drove males into a feral frenzy of lust and hunger. She was a liability, a walking distraction, and so she lived her life wrapped in bandages, covered in wood ash and mud to mask her scent, invisible and untouched. "Find the frost root," the beta had sneered at her this morning, shoving her out the back gates of the compound. "And if you come back empty-handed, runt, don't bother coming back at all. We'll leave you for the rogues." Alara looked down at her woven basket. It was empty, save for a few withered stems. The blizzard had descended hours earlier than predicted, burying the forest floor in a thick blanket of white. Finding a frost root in this weather was impossible. It was a death sentence disguised as an errand. She pushed off the tree, her legs trembling. If she stopped moving, she would freeze. If she returned empty-handed, she would be beaten. And a beating was a death sentence for someone with her condition. She was trapped between the indifference of nature and the cruelty of her kin. A gust of wind nearly knocked her over, whipping her hair across her face. As she stumbled, her hand flailed out to catch her balance. Her palm grazed the jagged bark of the pine. A sharp sting, hot and immediate, flared in. The center of her hand, Alara froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. She pulled her hand back, clutching it to her chest, her eyes wide. She peeled back the gray, fingerless glove. There, stark against her pale skin, was a thin red line, a scratch, a tiny, insignificant scratch that would be nothing to a normal shifter. But for her, it was a catastrophe. A bead of ruby-red liquid welled up, bright and glistening. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, please." She fumbled in her pocket, her numb fingers clumsy, as she retrieved a small pot of salve and a strip of linen she always carried. She had to seal it. immediately, before the wind carried the scent, before the monsters in the dark caught the drift of her sweetness. But as she pressed the cloth to her palm, her nose twitched. She froze again. The wind had shifted. It was blowing toward her, carrying a scent from deeper in the woods. Alara sniffed the air, confused. It wasn't the smell of pine or snow. It wasn't the musk of a deer. It was blood, but it wasn't her blood. It didn't have the cloying, sugary sweetness that marked her curse. This blood smelled dark. It smelled like iron and copper, heavy and rich. It smelled like old earth and ozone. It was the blood of a predator, an alpha, thick with power and ancient magic. And underneath the metallic tang, there was something else, something sour and acrid. Wolfsbane, curiosity, a dangerous trait for an Omega, tugged at her. She should run. She should turn back toward the compound. Empty basket or not. An injured alpha in the woods was the most dangerous thing imaginable. A wounded beast lashed out at anything that moved. Yet, her feet didn't turn back. The scent of the wolfsbane was heavy. Someone was dying alone in the cold, just as she was destined to do. A pang of empathy, sharp and unwanted, pierced her chest. She knew what it was like to be discarded. She knew what it was like to suffer while the world turned a blind eye. Alara took a step forward, then another. She followed the trail of the scent, the iron tang growing stronger with every yard, overcoming the smell of the storm. She crested a small ridge and looked down into a ravine. There, nestled against the side of a granite cliff, was a shallow cave, its mouth partially obscured by a fallen log. The snow around the entrance was disturbed, stained with dark, almost black patches that Alara knew were frozen blood. She crept closer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The wind died down as she entered the shelter of the ravine, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence. She reached the mouth of the cave and peered inside. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. Lying in the gloom was a wolf, but to call him a wolf seemed an insult to the sheer magnitude of the creature. He was massive, easily twice the size of the wolves in her pack. His fur was pitch black, darker than the shadows, clinging to the cave walls, an absorbing void of obsidian. He was lying on his side, his massive chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. Alara's eyes adjusted to the dim light. The beast was wrecked. His flank was matted with blood, 3 long claw marks tearing through the thick coat. But it was the smell coming from his shoulder that made her eyes water. A silver arrow shaft had been snapped off, leaving the head embedded deep in the muscle. The flesh around the wound was black and necrotizing, pumping the acrid scent of wolfsbane into the air. He was trembling, not just shivering from the cold, but convulsing. The poison was shutting down his nervous system. Alara stood paralyzed at the entrance. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run. This was an alpha. Even half dead, he could snap her neck with a single bite. He was a monster, a creature of violence and dominance. The wolf's ear twitched. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the floor of the cave, felt in the soles of her boots before it was heard. He lifted his head. Alara stopped breathing. His eyes were a terrifying shade of gold, but they were clouded with a milky haze of pain and delirium. He looked at her, but she wasn't sure he truly saw her. He bared his teeth, long, white daggers designed to tear flesh from bone. Snarls ripped from his throat, wet and gurgling. He tried to rise, his massive paws scrabbling against the stone floor, but his legs collapsed under him. He fell back with a heavy thud, a whine of frustration and agony escaping him. He was trapped. He was powerful, lethal, and magnificent, and he was dying in the dirt, consumed by poison and cold. Alara looked at his eyes again. Beneath the gold and the haze, she saw it. The fear, the raw, naked fear of a creature that knows its end has come. She looked at her own hand, still clutched to her chest, the bandage stained with a single dot of her own blood. She looked at the empty basket that would earn her a beating if she returned. She had nothing. She was nothing. The world had told her that her entire life, she was the runt, the waste of space, the mistake. But looking at this fallen king of the forest, she didn't feel like a mistake. She felt needed. The wolf let out a long, shuddering exhale, his head dropping back to the stone. His eyes began to close, the fight draining out of him as the wolfsbane claimed his heart. "No," Alara whispered. She dropped her basket. It hit the snow with a soft whomp. She stepped into the cave. The wolf's eyes snapped open. He snarled again. A warning, a promise of death. He snapped his jaws at the air, trying to ward her off. "I'm not going to hurt you," Alara said, her voice trembling, but surprisingly clear in the small space. She held her hands up, palms open, showing him she held no weapon. "I'm not going to hurt you." She moved closer, inch by cautious inch. The smell of him was overwhelming now. The blood, the rot, the wild masculine musk. It was terrifying, but it was also magnetic. She knelt in the dirt, just out of range of his teeth. The cold radiating off him was shocking. An alpha should be a furnace of heat, but he was freezing. His body was prioritizing his organs, pulling warmth from his extremities to fight the poison. He would freeze to death before the wolfsbane killed him. He watched her, his growls subsiding into weak, hitched breaths. He was too weak to fight her anymore. He was watching her the way a prey animal watches the predator, waiting for the killing blow. He thought she was here to finish him off. Alara reached out. Her hand hovered over his massive head. She could feel the coarse texture of his fur even before she touched it. She could see the tension in his muscles, coiled tight as stone. "You're dying," she whispered softly. "And I'm supposed to be gathering roots." She looked back at the storm raging outside the cave mouth. The whiteout was total now. There was no going back. Not today. She turned back to the wolf. She unclasped her cloak. It was thin, patched wool, barely enough to keep her alive. But it was all she had. With shaking hands, she laid the cloak over the wolf's shivering flank. The wolf flinched at the touch, a ripple of muscle rolling down his spine. But he didn't snap. He let out a soft huff of air, his golden eyes fixing on hers with a sudden, piercing clarity. Alara didn't pull away. She sank down into the dirt beside him, ignoring the damp cold seeping into her knees. She moved closer until her side was pressed against the thick fur of his back, trying to share what little body heat she possessed. "I don't know who you are," she murmured, pulling the edges of the cloak to cover him better. "And you probably would have killed me if you were standing. But I won't let you die alone in the dark." The wolf's breathing hitched, then slowed. The tension didn't leave his body, but the growling stopped. He was accepting her presence, or perhaps he was just too far gone to care. Alara closed her eyes, listening to the wind scream outside, aware that with every minute she stayed, the danger grew. But for the first time in her miserable, lonely life, she wasn't invisible. She was the only thing standing between this magnificent beast and the void. She stayed. The silence in the cave was heavier than the stone walls surrounding them. Outside, the blizzard had escalated into a white fury, sealing the entrance with a growing drift of snow. The wind no longer screamed. It moaned, a low, vibrato thrum that vibrated against Alara's spine. But inside, the only sound was the wet, rattling breath of the dying wolf. Alara sat back on her heels, her knees protesting against the hard rock floor. She had done what she could to make him comfortable, arranging her meager cloak over his core, tucking the edges under his massive flank to trap the heat. But it wasn't enough. She placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, avoiding the blackened ruin where the arrow had struck. He was freezing. The icy chill radiating from his fur was terrifying. It was a cold that spoke of slowing hearts and thickening blood. His body was losing the battle. "You're too big," she whispered, her voice sounding small and foolish in the gloom. "I can't warm you like this." The wolf didn't respond. His eyes were closed now, his head heavy on the dirt. Occasionally, a tremor would seize his massive frame, starting at his paws and rolling up his spine like a shockwave. Every tremor was weaker than the last. Alara looked around the cave, desperation clawing at her throat. She needed heat, fire. She crawled deeper into the shadows of the fissure, her hands sweeping over the floor. The cave was dry, thankfully, shielded from the worst of the moisture. Her fingers brushed against debris, dried pine needles blown in from previous storms, twigs, a few thicker branches dragged in by some long-gone animal. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She gathered the kindling into a small pile near the wolf's head, careful not to get too close to his jaws. Even dying, an alpha's reflex could take her hand off. She dug into the pouch at her waist, retrieving her flint and steel. They were old, worn down from years of use, discarded by the pack warriors and scavenged by her. Strike. A spark died in the cold air. Strike. Another spark, swallowed by the dark. Strike. "Come on," she hissed, her fingers aching. "Please." On the fourth strike, a spark caught a cluster of dried moss. A tiny orange glow bloomed. Alara huddled over it, shielding it with her body, feeding it oxygen with soft, frantic breaths. She fed it a pine needle, then a twig. The flame grew, licking hungrily at the wood. Slowly, agonizingly, the fire took hold. A sphere of warm, amber light pushed back the shadows. It illuminated the wolf fully for the first time, and Alara gasped. In the firelight, the damage was horrific. The veins spreading from the arrow wound weren't just black. They were pulsing with a sickly, necrotic green. The poison was alive, hunting down his vitality. She recognized the pattern of the infection immediately. She had seen it once before, years ago, when a young sentry had been grazed by a rogue's poisoned blade. He had died screaming within the hour. This wolf had lasted much longer. His strength must be godlike to have survived this far, but even gods could bleed. Alara reached into her basket, though she knew it was empty. She turned her pockets inside out. Lint, a smooth stone, a piece of string, nothing. She had no king's foil, no silverbane, no antidotes. She was a herbalist without herbs, a healer with empty hands. She looked at the wolf. His breathing had shallowed to barely a flutter. The fire warmed the air. But it wouldn't be enough to burn the poison out of his blood. He needed energy. He needed a surge of vitality to kickstart his healing factor. He needed life. A memory surfaced from the depths of her childhood, a hushed whisper between two elders she had eavesdropped on while scrubbing the floor. They spoke of the Omega Curse. They spoke of the sweet blood, not just as a lure for lust, but as a potent, forbidden source of power. The blood of the cursed is life, they had said. It is the nectar of the moon. It drives men mad, but it can pull a wolf back from the brink of the abyss. Alara looked at her left hand. She looked at the thin, pale skin of her wrist, where the blue veins hummed with the very fluid that made her a pariah. It was suicide. Her blood didn't clot. If she opened a vein, she risked bleeding out right here beside him. She risked becoming a corpse to save a corpse. And even if she survived the blood loss, the scent of her blood in a confined space with a feral alpha, it would be like tossing a match into a keg of gunpowder. If the blood revived him, the lust might consume him. He could tear her apart in a frenzy of need. The wolf whimpered again. It was a high, keen sound, stripped of all dominance. It was the sound of a living thing terrified of the dark. Alara felt tears prick her eyes. She hated her weakness. She hated her fear. But more than anything, she hated the idea of letting something this magnificent simply fade away because she was too cowardly to bleed. "I have nothing else to give you," she whispered to the unconscious beast. She unbuckled the small knife from her belt. It was dull, used for cutting thick stems, but it would serve. "Just, please don't kill me." She moved closer to his head. The heat from his fever was radiating off him now, a dry, sickly warmth. She positioned her wrist over his muzzle. Her hand shook violently. She took a deep breath, squeezed her eyes shut, and sliced. The pain was sharp and white-hot, a line of fire across her palm. Alara gasped, her eyes flying open. The blood didn't trickle. It welled up instantly, fast and free, too fast. It ran in a dark, crimson river down the lifeline of her palm. And then the smell hit her. It wasn't metallic. It didn't smell like copper. It exploded into the cave like a crushed bouquet of night-blooming jasmine, like warm honey and vanilla, like the deepest, most primal musk of a mating season. It was thick, heavy, and intoxicatingly sweet. The effect on the wolf was instantaneous. His eyes snapped open. The milky haze was gone, replaced by a flash of gold, so bright it looked like molten coin. His nostrils flared wide, drinking in the scent. A low rumble started in his chest, not a growl of aggression, but a purr of absolute, starving want. Alara trembled, holding her bleeding hand over his mouth. "Drink," she commanded, her voice barely audible over the roaring of her own pulse. "Take it." The wolf didn't need to be told. Instinct, ancient and overriding, took the wheel. He lifted his head, his movements jerky and desperate. He opened his jaws, his tongue, rough as sandpaper and hot as a brand, lashing out to catch the falling drops. The sensation of his tongue against her sensitive, wounded palm made Alara's knees buckle. A jolt of electricity shot up her arm, settling heavy and hot in her lower belly. This was intimate. It was forbidden. It was more profound than any mating rite. He licked the blood from her skin, groaning as the vitality hit his system. She could almost see it working. The sweet blood was a super fuel. As he lapped at her wound, his breathing deepened. The frantic, thready rhythm of his heart slowed into a powerful, drum-like beat. The green pulsing in his veins began to recede, beaten back by the influx of pure, potent life force. But Alara was fading. The blood was flowing too freely. The cut was too deep. The edges of her vision began to blur, softening into gray wool. She felt light, untethered, as if gravity were losing its hold on her. "Enough," she mumbled, trying to pull her hand away. The wolf growled, a possessive, vibrating sound, and followed her hand. He didn't bite, but he nudged her palm with his wet nose, licking frantically, trying to seal the wound with his own saliva. He knew, somewhere in that feral mind, he knew she was draining herself for him. He licked the cut, over and over, his tongue broad and soothing. The enzymes in alpha saliva were a powerful coagulant, usually reserved for mates or pups. He lavished attention on her palm until the flow finally, miraculously, slowed to a sluggish ooze. Alara slumped back against the cave wall, the knife clattering from her other hand. She was dizzy. The cave was spinning slowly to the left. She felt cold, colder than she had outside. The blood loss had sapped her internal heat. She looked at the wolf. He was no longer convulsing. He was watching her. His head was raised, his golden eyes clear and focused, locked onto her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He wasn't just an animal anymore. There was a man in there, a man who saw her. He let out a soft woof of air and nudged her thigh with his massive head. "I'm okay," she lied, her teeth chattering. "I'm just cold." The fire was dying down, consuming the last of the dry moss. The shadows were creeping back in. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. She was going into shock. She had saved him, but she had doomed herself. The wolf shifted. He groaned, the sound deep and pained, as he forced his massive body to move. He didn't stand. He was still too weak for that, but he dragged himself across the stone floor. He moved until he was no longer lying parallel to her, but curling around her. He was building a nest, and she was the center of it. He nudged her again, harder this time, pushing her down. "What?" Alara gasped, too weak to resist. She sank to the floor. The wolf immediately draped his heavy head over her legs. He curled his massive body around her small form, creating a wall of black fur and muscle between her and the cold air of the cave. The heat coming off him was incredible. Now that the poison was receding, his natural alpha temperature was returning. He was a furnace. Alara hesitated for a heartbeat. This was an alpha. To touch him without permission was a crime. To lie with him was madness. But she was freezing, and the heat was so inviting. With a soft sob of surrender, Alara turned into him. She pressed her face into the thick, coarse fur of his neck. She buried her hands in his coat. She pulled her knees up, curling into a tight ball against his chest. It was heaven. It was safety. For the first time in 22 years, Alara felt safe. The wolf exhaled, a long, deep sound of contentment. He shifted slightly, bringing his hind leg over her, effectively pinning her against him. He was claiming her, even in sleep. He was keeping his resource safe. The scent of her blood still hung heavy in the air. mixing with the musk of his fur in the smoke of the dying fire. It was a heady, drugged atmosphere. Alara's eyes felt heavy. The darkness of the cave seemed to soften, becoming a velvet blanket rather than a void. She could hear the wolf's heart beating against her ear. Thump, 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 strong and steady. It was a lullaby. "You're welcome," she whispered into his fur, her voice slurring as consciousness slipped away. The last thing she felt before the darkness took her was the rough, wet glide of his tongue against her cheek, wiping away a smudge of ash. A thank you, a promise. Then the fire died, and they slept in the dark, two broken things holding each other together against the storm. Light. It was the first thing Alara noticed, not the flickering, amber warmth of the fire that had long since died into a pile of gray ash, but the harsh, pale blue light of a winter morning filtering through the snow-blocked entrance of the cave. The second thing she noticed was the heat. She was not freezing. In fact, she was warm, impossibly warm. A heavy, solid weight was draped over her waist, pinning her to the stone floor, and a wall of scorching heat was pressed against her back. It felt like she was sleeping against a furnace. Memory returned in a sluggish, disjointed trickle. The storm, the wolfsbane, the giant black wolf, the knife, the blood, the blood. Alara gasped, her eyes flying open. She tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea rolled over her, slamming her back down. The world spun dizzily. She was weak, her limbs feeling like they were filled with lead. She had lost too much. She had given too much. She blinked, trying to clear her vision. She expected to see the coarse black fur of the wolf. She expected to smell the wet, animal musk of the beast. Instead, she was looking at skin, bronze, sun-starved skin, stretched taut over hard muscle. It was a back, a human back. Alara's breath hitched in her throat. She shifted slightly, her movement causing the arm draped over her waist to tighten reflexively. It wasn't a paw. It was a forearm, thick with corded muscle, dusted with dark hair, ending in a hand large enough to crush her skull. The wolf was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of her blood loss. She knew what this meant. Every shifter had a human form, but usually the transition required conscious effort. For a wolf to shift back while unconscious meant the healing was complete. The beast had retreated, satisfied that the vessel was safe. She was lying in the arms of a strange man, a naked, alpha male stranger. Alara slowly, carefully, tried to slide out from under the heavy arm. She needed to see his face. She needed to know if she had saved a savior or a monster. She managed to roll onto her back. The movement disturbed him. The man groaned, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated deep in his chest and rolled over. Alara stopped breathing. He was devastating. Even in the grime of the cave, covered in dried mud and streaks of old blood, he was beautiful in a way that was almost painful to look at. His hair was black as a raven's wing, falling in tangled waves over his forehead. His jaw was square and covered in a heavy shadow of stubble. A thick, jagged scar ran from his temple down to his jawline, a testament to a life of violence. But it didn't mar his features. It only enhanced the brutal symmetry of his face. But it was his body that terrified her. He was massive, shoulders that spanned the width of the sleeping space, a chest that looked carved from granite, and a torso crisscrossed with old white scars. And there, on his left shoulder, where the necrotizing arrow wound had been, Alara reached out, her fingers hovering inches from his skin. The black rot was gone. The green poison was gone. In its place was fresh, pink skin, knitting together at a supernatural speed. A faint, jagged line remained, but the infection had been burned out. Her blood, it had worked. "You're alive," she whispered, the words barely forming on her dry lips. Suddenly, the man's nostrils flared, his brow furrowed in his sleep. He inhaled sharply, a deep, testing sniff. His eyes snapped open. Alara froze. They were the same eyes, gold, molten, burning gold. But the milky haze of the wolf was gone, replaced by a terrifying, razor-sharp intelligence. There was no confusion in those eyes, only instant, predatory awareness. He moved faster than humanly possible. In a blur of motion, he was over her. He pinned her wrists to the stone floor with one hand, his other forearm pressing against her collarbone, not choking her, but holding her immobile. "Who are you?" His voice was a weapon. It was deep, gravelly, and commanded absolute obedience. It wasn't a question. It was an interrogation. Alara stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was terrified, yes, but beneath the fear, there was something else. A strange, magnetic pull. His scent, rain, ozone, and power washed over her, drowning out the smell of the damp cave. I'm Alara," she stammered. The alpha stared down at her, his golden gaze sweeping over her face. He took in the dirt-smudged cheeks, the pale lips, the terrified eyes. He looked at the rags she wore. The ash rubbed into her skin to hide her scent. His lip curled slightly, not in disgust, but in confusion. "A rogue?" he growled. "An exile? A runt," she whispered, the shame of the title burning her cheeks. "From the gray moon pack." He frowned. He lowered his head, sniffing the hollow of her throat. He inhaled deeply, and his body went rigid. "That scent," he murmured, his voice losing some of its edge. "Vanilla, honey, iron." He pulled back, looking at her with a sudden, dawning realization. He looked at his own shoulder, seeing the healed wound. He looked at the dried blood on his own chin. Then, he looked at her left hand, still pinned under his grip. He released her wrist instantly, as if he had been burned. He grabbed her hand, bringing it up to his face. The bandage she had hastily applied the night before had fallen off during the night. The cut on her palm was angry and red, though sealed by his wolf's saliva. "You," he breathed. The realization crashed into him. "The wolf, I remember the cold. I remember the pain. And then, you." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He didn't see the rags or the dirt. He saw the pallor of her skin. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the tremor in her hands. "You fed me," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You fed me your blood." Alara nodded, too scared to speak. The alpha's expression shattered. The aggression vanished, replaced by a look of profound shock. He sat back on his heels, releasing her, giving her space. He ran a hand through his hair, his chest heaving. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his gaze intense. Alara shook her head. I saw the size of your wolf. I knew you were an alpha, but I don't know your name." He stared at her for a long moment, silence stretching between them. "I am Kaelin Blackwood." Alara gasped. The air left her lungs. Kaelin Blackwood, the alpha of the Obsidian Shadow Pack, the king of the North. They called him the Butcher King. Stories were told of his ruthlessness, of how he slaughtered the entire Red Tooth clan for encroaching on his borders. He was a myth, a monster, a king who ruled with iron and blood. And she, the pack runt, had spent the night curled against his naked chest. Alara scrambled backward, her back hitting the cold stone wall. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small. "I didn't know," she squeaked. "I swear I didn't know. I couldn't let you die." Kaelin didn't move. He watched her retreat with an unreadable expression. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why save a monster, little mouse? You could have left me to the ice. You could have run." "I know what it's like," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "To be cold, to be hurt, to be alone." She looked up, her eyes wet. "Nobody deserves to die like that, not even a monster." Something in Kaelin's face softened. A crack appeared in the stone facade of the Butcher King. He moved then. He didn't lunge. He crawled toward her, slow and deliberate, telegraphing every movement so as not to frighten her. He stopped when he was just inches away. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. "You are hurt," he said. "I'm fine," she lied. "It's just a scratch." "Don't lie to me," he growled softly. "I can smell the blood loss on you. You're faint. Your heart is skipping beats." He gently took her left hand again. He cradled it in his massive palms as if it were made of spun glass. He looked at the angry red slash across her lifeline. "My blood," she started to warn him. "It's cursed. It doesn't clot right. That's why I'm the runt. I'm useless." "Useless," Kaelin repeated, his eyes flashing. "Your blood brought me back from the grave. It burned the wolfsbane out of my veins. It is not cursed, Alara. It is potent. It is life." He lifted her hand to his lips. Alara's breath hitched. "What are you doing?" "Healing what I took," he murmured. He didn't just kiss her hand. He extended his tongue, hot and wet, and licked the wound. Alara cried out, a soft, involuntary sound. The sensation was electric, where his wolf's tongue had been rough and soothing. The man's tongue was skilled and deliberate. He licked the length of the cut, his saliva tingling against her skin. It was an act of claiming. In shifter culture, licking a wound was something only done between mates or parents and children. It was the ultimate sign of protection. He pulled back, his eyes locked on hers. The wound on her hand was no longer angry red. It had turned a soft pink, sealed shut by the alpha enzymes. "Better?" he asked. Alara nodded, her face burning. "Yes." Kaelin didn't let go of her hand. He intertwined his fingers with hers. The contrast was stark. His large, scarred, tanned hand engulfing her small, pale, fragile one. "You gave your life force to save me," Kaelin said, his voice solemn, possessing the weight of a royal decree. "You risked the rage of a feral beast. You risked bleeding out in the snow." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. Alara stiffened, then melted. He was so warm. "I was alone in the dark," he whispered. "I was ready to let go. And then I tasted you. Sweet, strong." He pulled back slightly to look her in the eyes. "You are no runt, Alara. You are the reason the king still draws breath." He reached behind him and grabbed the tattered remains of her wool cloak. He wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it tight under her chin. Then he grabbed his own fur pelt, the one he had shifted out of, or perhaps a remnant of his clothing that had survived the shift, and draped it over her as well. "Can you stand?" he asked. I think so." She tried to rise, but her legs were water. She stumbled. Kaelin caught her before she dropped an inch. He swept her up into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing more than a snowflake. He held her high against his chest, her head resting in the crook of his neck. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "No," he rumbled, the vibration traveling through her body. "You have done enough walking. You have done enough bleeding." He walked toward the mouth of the cave. He kicked the snowdrift apart with a bare foot, ignoring the cold. He stepped out into the blinding white of the morning. The storm had passed. The world was silent and buried in snow. Alara looked at the vast, frozen landscape. "Where are we going? My pack. They'll be looking for me, to punish me." Kaelin stopped. His arms tightened around her, his grip bruising in its intensity. A low growl ripped from his throat, terrifying in its violence. "Let them look," Kaelin snarled, his eyes scanning the horizon for any threat. "Let them come." He looked down at her, and the ferocity in his eyes promised violence to the world and safety to her. "You are not going back to them, Alara. You belong to the Obsidian Pack now." "But I'm a nobody," she whispered. "No," Kaelin corrected her. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "You bled for me. Now I bleed for you. You are mine." He stepped forward, carrying her away from the gray moon territory, his bare feet leaving deep prints in the snow, marking a path toward a future she never dared to dream of. "We go home," he said, "and if anyone tries to take you from me, I will burn this forest to the ground." Alara closed her eyes, resting her head against the steady, thundering beat of his heart. For the first time, the sweet blood felt less like a curse and more like destiny. She was safe. The monster had her, and he wasn't letting go. The transition from the dead zone to the border of the gray moon territory was marked not by a change in landscape, but by a shift in the air. The oppressive silence of the wild gave way to the faint, acrid scent of wood smoke and the distant, muffled sounds of a pack preparing for the day. Alara lay curled against Kaelin's chest, her cheek pressed to the hard muscle of his shoulder. He carried her with an ease that bordered on insulting to the laws of physics. She was not a small child, but in his arms, she felt weightless. Every step he took was a testament to a power she couldn't comprehend. He was barefoot in the snow, wearing nothing but the tattered remains of trousers and the fur pelt draped over her. Yet he radiated a heat so intense it kept the winter chill at bay. "We are close," Kaelin rumbled. His voice vibrated through her ribs, a low warning note. "Your heart is beating faster. They'll be waiting," Alara whispered, a tremor of conditioned fear running through her. "The beta, Silas, he waits at the perimeter to check the baskets." "Let him wait," Kaelin said, his jaw tightening. As they cleared the final line of trees, the gray expanse of the pack grounds came into view. And just as she feared, a patrol was there. 3 wolves in human form, dressed in thick winter leathers, stood by the marker stones. In the center was Silas. The beta was a cruel man, with a face like a hatchet and eyes that always seemed to be searching for a reason to hurt someone. He was pacing, checking a pocket watch, his breath puffing in irritated clouds. When Kalen stepped into the clearing, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The 3 gray moon wolves froze. They stared at the massive, semi-naked stranger emerging from the blizzard like a vengeful god, carrying their pack's runt in his arms. Silas recovered first. His shock was quickly replaced by a sneer. He didn't recognize Kalen. Few had seen the Alpha King in the flesh and lived to describe him. And Kalen was currently covered in grime and dried blood. Silas saw only a rogue, a trespasser. "Well?" Silas barked, stepping forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the blade at his hip. "Look what the cat dragged in. Or rather, what the runt dragged in." He looked at Alara, his eyes narrowing with disgust. "You're late, girl. And where is my frost root? Did you decide to open your legs for a rogue instead of doing your duty?" Alara flinched, instinctively burying her face in Kalen's neck. The shame was a physical blow. Kalen stopped. He didn't put Alara down. He didn't step back. He simply stood there, a statue of bronze and iron, and the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Careful," Kalen said. His voice was soft, terrifyingly so. It sounded like the crack of ice on a frozen lake before the surface shatters. "Speak to her again, and I will rip your tongue from your head." Silas laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "You have spirit for a rogue. Do you know where you are? This is Gray Moon territory. And that," he pointed a gloved finger at Alara, "is my property. Put the bitch down, rogue. She has a whipping scheduled for being late." The air around Kalen shimmered. It was the alpha aura, a wave of pure, concentrated dominance that exploded outward from his body. It hit the 3 gray moon wolves like a physical shockwave. The 2 guards behind Silas whimpered and dropped to their knees, their instincts screaming at them to submit. They recognized the power, even if they didn't know the source. It was ancient. It was crushing. Silas staggered back, clutching his chest, his face draining of color. What are you?" "I am the judgment you were not expecting," Kalen intoned. He took a step forward. Silas scrambled backward, drawing his knife. It was a futile gesture, pathetic against the force advancing on him. "I said, put her down," Silas screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "No," Kalen said. With a movement too fast to track, Kalen lashed out with his free hand. He didn't even need to shift. He backhanded Silas across the face. The sound was like a gunshot. The beta was lifted off his feet and hurled 10 yards through the air, crashing into a pine tree with a sickening crunch of bone. Silas slumped to the ground, unconscious, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. The clearing fell silent. The 2 kneeling guards were shaking violently, their foreheads pressed into the snow. Kalen looked down at them. His golden eyes were burning. "Tell your alpha," he commanded, his voice booming across the clearing, "that Kalen Blackwood, the Alpha King of the Obsidian Shadow, has passed through here." The guards gasped, the color leaving their faces. "The Butcher King." "Tell him," Kalen continued, tightening his hold on Alara, "that he harbored a queen and treated her like a slave. Tell him he is lucky I have a woman to tend to, or I would wipe this pathetic pack from the face of the earth today." He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate disrespect. He walked away, carrying Alara past the boundaries of her prison, leaving the gray moon wolves trembling in the snow. Alara was trembling too. You told them I was a queen?" Kaelin looked down at her, the golden fire in his eyes softening into liquid amber. "I only spoke the truth. You saved a king. That makes you royalty by blood right, and soon by bond." The journey to the Obsidian Palace was a blur of exhaustion and awe. Kaelin had summoned his own detail not long after leaving the Grey Moonlands, and a sleek, black armored transport had whisked them away. Alara had fallen asleep in the back seat, her hand clutching Kaelin's tunic. When she woke, she was being carried again. They were indoors. The air was warm and smelled of cedar and expensive beeswax. She blinked her eyes open to see soaring ceilings of black marble, illuminated by chandeliers that held real fire. Banners of silk, embroidered with a silver wolf's head, hung from the walls. "We are home," Kaelin murmured against her hair. Servants in crisp uniforms stopped in the corridors, bowing low as their king passed. Their eyes widened when they saw the bundle in his arms, a small, dirty woman wrapped in the king's own furs, smelling of dried blood and the ash of the dead zone. But no one spoke. Kaelin's expression dared anyone to question her presence. He didn't take her to the infirmary. He didn't take her to the guest quarters. He kicked open the double doors at the end of the grand hall, the king's chambers. The room was vast, dominated by a massive bed draped in black velvet and furs. A fire roared in a stone hearth, large enough to roast a stag. But Kaelin walked past the bed, straight into the adjoining bathing chamber. It was a sanctuary of steam and stone. A sunken pool, carved from a single piece of dark granite, was filled with steaming water. Kaelin set her down gently on a velvet bench. Her legs were shaky, and she swayed. He steadied her, his hands large and warm on her waist. "Maids!" he barked toward the door. 2 women appeared instantly, towels in hand, looking terrified. "Yes, Your Majesty." Kaelin looked at Alara. He saw how she flinched at the presence of the strangers. He saw the way she pulled the fur tighter around her body, ashamed of her rags, ashamed of her scars. "Leave the oils and the towels," Kaelin commanded, "and the food. Then get out." "But sire, the washing—" "I will do it," Kaelin growled. The maids' jaws dropped, but they scurried to obey, leaving trays of scented oils, soft sponges, and a platter of roasted meat and bread before fleeing the room. The door clicked shut. Silence returned, heavy and intimate. Kaelin turned to Alara. "You are safe here," he said, his voice dropping to that rough, gentle timbre he reserved only for her. "No one will touch you but me, and I will never hurt you." He reached out and unclasped the fur cloak. It slid to the floor, pooling at her feet. Alara stood shivering in her tattered tunic and leggings, holes worn through the knees, stained with mud and the blood of her sacrifice. She felt ugly. She felt small. She crossed her arms over her chest. "I'm dirty," she whispered. "I smell like ash." "You smell like life," Kaelin corrected her. He stepped closer. With efficient, clinical hands, he peeled away the ruined layers of her clothing. The wool was stuck to her skin in places, and he was infinitely patient, working the fabric loose without causing her pain. When she was finally standing nude before him, she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the rejection, waiting for him to see the ribs showing through her skin, the bruises from the pack, the scars from years of clumsiness and cruelty. Instead, she heard a sharp intake of breath. "They starved you," he murmured. The anger in his voice was a low rumble of thunder. directed at those who had harmed her. I will hang them for every meal you missed. He lifted her again, stepping down into the sunken pool. The water was hot, biting at her frozen skin in a delicious rush. He sat on the submerged bench, pulling her into his lap. The water rose to her chest, milky with the bath salts he had tossed in. The heat seeped into her bones, loosening the knots of tension that had defined her existence for years. Kaelin took a sponge, soaked it in the water, and began to wash her. He started at her shoulders. He scrubbed away the gray ash she used to hide her scent. He washed the mud from her arms. He was meticulous, his movements reverent. As the grime washed away, the true scent of her, that cursed, beautiful vanilla and honey, began to rise with the steam, filling the room. "Look at you," Kaelin whispered. Alara opened her eyes. She looked down at her arm. The skin was pale, creamy, and unblemished beneath the dirt. Kaelin reached for a jar of oil, sandalwood and rose histel, poured it into his palm, and rubbed it into her skin. His calloused fingers glided over her collarbone, down her arms, avoiding the healing cut on her palm. "You hid this," he said, tracing the line of her jaw. "You hid your beauty." "I had to," she said, her voice trembling. "Because of the scent, because of the curse." "It is not a curse here," Kaelin vowed. He cupped water in his hand and poured it over her hair, rinsing out the tangles. "Here, it is a gift. You are the only thing in this world that smells like peace." He reached for the platter of food on the rim of the pool. He tore off a piece of warm, crusty bread, dipped it in the rich gravy of the roast, and held it to her lips. "Eat." Alara opened her mouth. The flavor exploded on her tongue. Salt, fat, rosemary, yeast. She moaned, a sound of pure pleasure. She hadn't eaten anything but stale crusts and watery stew in weeks. Kaelin's eyes darkened as he watched her eat. He fed her piece after piece, watching her chew, watching the color return to her cheeks. He fed her as if she were a starving bird, intent on nursing her back to health. When she was full and clean and warm, she leaned back against his chest. The water lapped around them. "Why?" she asked quietly. "I'm just an omega, a broken one." Kaelin wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her wet head. He looked at their reflection in the large mirror on the far wall, the massive, scarred king and the small, pale woman. "You found me when I was a beast," he said. "You saw the monster, and you gave him your blood. You didn't run. You didn't flinch." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "A wolf knows his mate, Alara. My soul knew yours the moment your blood touched my tongue. You are not broken. You are the other half of me." Alara looked at the reflection. For the first time, she didn't see a victim. She saw a woman held in the arms of a king. She saw the way he looked at her, with a possessiveness that promised to burn down the world to keep her safe. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the water and the warmth of the alpha seep into her soul. The cold of the dead zone felt 1,000,000 miles away. "I'm not going back," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "No," Kaelin agreed, tightening his hold. "You are already home." The silk of the dress was cool against Alara's skin, a sensation so foreign it felt like a dream. It was a deep, midnight blue, the color of the sky just before true darkness fell, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light of the chandeliers. For the first time in her life, She didn't look like a scavenger. She looked, almost, like she belonged. But she didn't feel like she belonged. Standing in the center of the king's private receiving room, Alara felt like a child playing dress-up in a giant's castle. The room was oppressive in its grandeur. Black marble floors, heavy tapestries depicting wars won by the obsidian pack, and furniture carved from dark, ancient wood that looked heavy enough to crush her. Kalen was pacing. He had been dressed by his valets in the formal black and gold uniform of the Alpha King, a stark contrast to the naked, vulnerable man she had held in the cave. The uniform made him look broader, harder. The collar concealed the healing bite of the frost, but nothing could hide the tension radiating off him. "I should not leave you," Kalen growled, stopping his pacing to look at her. His golden eyes were dark with frustration. "Not yet. It is too soon." Alara stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, before pulling back, remembering her place. "You have a council to lead, Kalen. You said the assassination attempt came from within. You have to find them." Kalen captured her retreating hand. He pressed it to the center of his chest, right over his heart. "The traitors can wait. My wolf does not want to leave you." "I'll be safe," she promised, forcing a smile she didn't quite feel. "I'm in your chambers. Who would dare come in here?" "No one who values their life," Kalen stated, his tone grim. He squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing the bandage on her palm. "I have posted 4 of my elite guard at the doors. Do not leave this room, Alara. Not for anything. I will return before the sun sets." He leaned down, stealing a quick, fierce kiss that left her breathless, tasting of coffee and dominance. Then, with a swirl of his heavy cape, he was gone. The heavy oak doors boomed shut, locking with a definitive thud. Alara was alone. The silence of the palace was different from the silence of the woods. It was watchful. She wandered the room, trailing her fingers over the spine of a leather-bound book, touching the petals of a black orchid in a crystal vase. She felt safe, yes, but also exposed. She was the runt of gray moon, wrapped in the king's silk, waiting for the world to realize the mistake. An hour passed, then 2. A knock came at the door, not the heavy, rhythmic pound of a guard, but a sharp, staccato rap. Alara froze. "Who is it?" "Service, my lady," a voice called out. It was female, smooth and polite. "The king requested refreshments be brought to you." Alara hesitated. Kalen hadn't mentioned food, but he had been obsessed with feeding her earlier. It seemed like something he would do. "Come in," she called. The door opened, but it wasn't a maid who entered. The woman who swept into the room was stunning. She was tall, statuesque, with hair like spun silver and eyes the color of ice. She wore a gown of crimson velvet that hugged every curve of her predatory frame. She moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a hunting cat. Behind her, the elite guards were nowhere to be seen. Alara took a step back, her heart leaping into her throat. You aren't a servant." The woman laughed. It was a cold, tinkling sound, like glass breaking on stone. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it casually. "Observant little thing, aren't you?" "No, I am, Lady Vesper, daughter of the High Beta, and until yesterday, the intended queen of this pack." Alara's blood ran cold. The rival. "Where are the guards?" Alara whispered, backing away until her hips bumped against the heavy oak table. "Distracted," Vesper said. waving a manicured hand dismissively. My father has called them away for a security breach in the West Wing. It buys us a few minutes of girl talk. Vesper pushed off the door and began to circle the room. Her eyes locked on Alara. She sniffed the air, her nose wrinkling in distaste. So, Vesper purred, her voice dripping with venom. This is the creature Kaelin dragged out of the mud. I expected more. You're tiny. You look like you'd snap in a strong wind. I saved his life, Alara said, her voice shaking but defiant. Did you? Vesper stopped, standing just a few feet away. She loomed over Alara, her height advantage significant. Or did you just stumble upon him and drug him with that stench of yours? Vesper leaned in, inhaling sharply near Alara's neck. She recoiled, a look of genuine disgust warring with something darker in her eyes. Gods, Vesper hissed. It's cloying. You smell like a bakery, like sugar and rot. You smell like prey. Alara flushed, wrapping her arms around herself. It's my curse. I can't help it. A curse? Vesper sneered. It's a dinner bell, little mouse. You think Kaelin wants you? You think an alpha of his power could ever truly mate with a defective omega runt? She laughed again, harsh and mocking. He is confused. He was poisoned, delirious. He smelled something sweet and edible, and his instincts took over. He doesn't want a queen. He wants a snack. That's not true, Alara whispered, but the words struck deep, hitting the very core of her insecurity. He claimed me. He claimed a warm body to heat his bed, Vesper corrected, stepping closer, crowding Alara against the table. Look at you. You have no muscle, no magic, no lineage. You are a genetic mistake. Do you really think the Obsidian Pack will bow to you? We are wolves, girl. We follow strength. And you... Vesper reached out, her fingernail, sharp and manicured to a point, tracing the line of Alara's throat. You are nothing but a walking blood bag. Leave me alone, Alara said, turning her face away. I don't think I will, Vesper murmured. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, violent impulse. I want to see what makes you so special. I want to see if you bleed gold. Vesper shoved her. It wasn't a playful push. It was a beta strength shove, fueled by jealousy and rage. Alara flew backward. She tried to catch herself, but her hip struck the edge of the heavy oak table. She spun, losing her balance, and crashed into a pedestal holding a large crystal vase. The vase shattered. Alara hit the floor hard, the breath leaving her lungs in a pained whoosh. Shards of crystal rained down around her. Oops, Vesper deadpanned, towering over her. Clumsy, Alara gasped, pushing herself up. A sharp, stinging pain flared in her forearm. She looked down. A jagged shard of crystal, long as a dagger, had sliced across her right forearm. It wasn't a deep wound, but for Alara, depth didn't matter. No, she breathed. The blood welled up, bright, ruby red. It didn't bead, it ran. It poured from the cut, soaking into the sleeve of the midnight blue dress, turning the silk black. And the scent hit the air. It was instantaneous. The smell of vanilla, honey, and raw, potent attraction exploded in the confined space. It was suffocatingly sweet. Vesper's eyes widened. Her nostrils flared. She had intended to bully, perhaps to bruise, but she hadn't anticipated the potency of the blood itself. "What?" Vesper stepped back, her hand going to her throat. Her pupils dilated, swallowing the ice blue of her irises. "What is that?" "Get out!" Alara screamed, clutching her arm, trying to staunch the flow with her other hand. "Get out before you kill me!" But Vesper didn't leave. She stood frozen, swaying slightly. The wolf inside her was reacting to the scent. It was the scent of the ultimate prey, the ultimate prize. It triggered a prey drive so intense it overrode logic. Vesper's lip curled back, revealing her teeth. A low growl started in her throat. She looked at Alara, not with hatred, but with hunger. The door to the chambers burst open. It wasn't Kaelin. It was one of the elite guards who had been lured away, rushing back to his post. He stopped in the doorway, his weapon drawn. "My lady, we heard a crash." The guard froze. He dropped his weapon. His head snapped toward Alara, his eyes instantly turning entirely black. The scent hit him like a physical blow. He groaned, a sound of pure, agonized want. "Mine," the guard whispered, stepping into the room, forgetting his duty, forgetting his king. "No!" Alara scrambled backward, sliding on the marble floor, leaving a streak of red behind her. Vesper shook her head, trying to clear the fog. She's doing it on purpose," she shrieked, her voice hysterical. "She's bewitching us." Vesper lunged, whether to kill Alara or simply to stop the scent. She didn't know. Her hands were claws, aiming for Alara's throat. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, raising her bleeding arm to shield her face. Boom! The entire room shook. The balcony doors, made of reinforced glass and iron, exploded inward. Shattered glass sprayed across the room like diamond dust. Through the wreckage, a black shadow moved. It was a blur of violence, moving faster than thought. A roar, so loud it cracked the plaster on the ceiling, filled the air. It wasn't a human shout. It was the roar of a monster. Vesper was lifted off her feet. Kaelin, half shifted, his eyes glowing like twin suns, his teeth elongated into fangs, had crossed the room in a single leap. He caught Vesper by the throat, mid-lunge. He didn't just stop her. He slammed her into the stone wall, on the far side of the room, with enough force to crater the masonry. Vesper slumped to the floor, gasping, clutching her crushed throat, too stunned to even shift. The guard in the doorway, seeing the king, tried to snap out of his trance. "My king, the scent, I couldn't..." Kaelin didn't listen. He spun, a guttural snarl ripping from his chest. He grabbed the heavy oak table, solid wood weighing hundreds of pounds, and flipped it over with one hand, creating a barricade between the door and Alara. "Out!" Kaelin roared at the guard. The command was laced with alpha magic, so potent it forced the guard to his knees. "Get out, or I will tear your head off!" The guard scrambled backward, terrified, fleeing down the corridor. Kaelin slammed the main door shut with a wave of his hand, engaging the deadbolt with a telekinetic slam of force. Silence fell, heavy and terrified. The only sound was Vesper's wheezing breaths from the corner and the dripping of Alara's blood onto the floor. Alara cowered amidst the glass shards, holding her bleeding arm. She was shaking violently. The scent was everywhere. She waited for Kaelin to turn on her. She waited for the sweet blood to drive him mad, just as Vesper said it would. She waited for him to see her as meat. Kaelin turned slowly. His chest was heaving, His uniform was torn at the shoulder where his muscles had expanded in his partial shift. His claws were fully extended. He looked at Vesper, who was trying to crawl away. "You touched her," Kalen said. His voice was devoid of humanity. It was the voice of the void. "You spilled her blood." "Kalen, please," Vesper rasped, blood bubbling on her lips. She provoked me. The smell." "That smell," Kalen said, walking toward Alara, ignoring Vesper completely, "is the smell of my soul." Vesper's eyes went wide. She realized too late the magnitude of her error. Kalen reached Alara. She flinched, curling into a ball. "Alara," he choked out. He fell to his knees in the glass. He didn't care about the shards cutting his skin. He reached for her, his hands trembling. But he didn't reach for her throat. He reached for her injured arm. His eyes were wild, fighting the prey drive, fighting the biology that told him to bite. But his heart, his love, was stronger. "I'm sorry," Alara sobbed. "I'm sorry. I made a mess. I'm sorry I smell." "No," Kalen groaned. He ripped the silk sash from his waist. He wrapped it tight around her forearm, winding it again and again, applying pressure. "Don't apologize. Never apologize for bleeding." He pulled her into his lap, crushing her against his chest, burying his face in her neck. He inhaled deeply, not the blood, but her skin, her hair. "I should have killed her," he growled into her ear, his body vibrating with adrenaline. "I will kill her." "The scent," Alara whispered. Does it hurt you?" Kalen pulled back. His eyes were blown wide. The gold consuming the white. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He was fighting a war inside his own skull. "It makes me want to devour you," he admitted, his voice raw. "But not like they do. I don't want to consume you, Alara." He cupped her face, his thumbs smearing a streak of her blood onto her cheek. "I want to keep you," he vowed. "I want to bury you inside me, so the world can never touch you again." He looked over his shoulder at Vesper, who was watching them with terrified awe. "Guards!" Kalen bellowed, his voice carrying through the thick doors. The doors edged open. The captain of the guard stood there, head bowed, eyes averted to avoid the challenge. "Take Lady Vesper to the dungeons," Kalen commanded, turning back to Alara. "Prepare the executioner's block for dawn." "No!" Vesper screamed as two guards dragged her out. "Kalen, I am a beta. You can't." "You touched my queen," Kalen snarled, baring his fangs. "You are meat." The doors slammed shut again. Alara looked at the sash around her arm. The blood was soaking through, but slower now. "The bleeding won't stop," she whispered, the familiar wooziness returning. "Kalen, I'm cold." Kalen scooped her up. He carried her, not to the bed, but to the center of the room. Amidst the wreckage, he sat down, cradling her. "It will stop," he said, a new resolve hardening his features. "I will make it stop. Forever." He looked at the junction of her neck and shoulder, the mating spot. "I have to claim you, Alara," he said, his voice urgent. "Not just with words. The mating bite. My venom will change your blood. It will cure the defect. You will never bleed like this again." Alara looked up at him. She saw the hunger, yes, but she saw the desperation. He was terrified of losing her. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "Yes," he whispered. "But then, we will be one." Alara reached up, her bloody hand touching his cheek. "Do it." Kalen lowered his head, his fangs grazing the sensitive skin of her neck. He paused, his breath hot against her pulse. "For eternity," he whispered. And then he bit down. The pain was absolute, a white-hot spike that drove through the tender muscle of her shoulder and anchored itself deep in her soul. Alara cried out, her back arching off the floor, her fingers digging into Kaelin's shoulders. It felt less like a bite and more like a branding iron, searing his name into her very essence. But then, the pain shattered. It dissolved into a rush of liquid fire that poured from his fangs into her veins. It wasn't blood. It was venom. It was magic. It was the concentrated, ancient power of the Alpha King. Alara gasped, her eyes flying wide open, staring up at the shattered ceiling of the chamber. She could feel the change happening in real time. It started at the wound on her neck, a golden warmth that raced down her arm, hunting the injury caused by the crystal shard. She felt the skin knit together, the flesh sealing with a speed that made her head spin. The steady, terrifying drip of her own blood stopped instantly. The warmth didn't stop there. It flooded her chest, wrapping around her heart, forcing it to beat in a new, powerful rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. It matched the thunderous beat of the man holding her. It sank into her bones, chasing away the marrow-deep cold that had plagued her since birth. The fragility, the sensation of being made of glass, always one slip away from shattering, evaporated. In its place was iron. In its place was a durability she had never known. Kaelin pulled back slowly, his chest heaving against hers. His mouth was stained with the last drops of her mortal blood, but his eyes were shining with triumph. He licked the bite mark on her neck once, sealing it forever. "It is done," he rasped, his voice vibrating not just in her ears, but in her mind. Alara blinked. The world looked different. The colors were sharper. The dust motes dancing in the light of the chandeliers seemed to hum with energy. She could smell the snow outside, the ozone of the storm, the fear of the guards in the hall, and the overwhelming, grounding scent of him. She looked at her forearm. Kaelin unwound the blood-soaked sash. Beneath it, there was no wound, not even a scar, just smooth, pale skin that hummed with a faint, golden luminescence. "My blood," she whispered, her voice stronger, devoid of the tremor that used to define it. It stopped. "You are no longer bound by the weakness of your birth," Kaelin vowed. Pulling her to her feet, she stood. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel lightheaded. She didn't feel faint. She felt solid. She felt like she could tear the heavy oak doors off their hinges if she tried. "I can hear them," Alara said, turning her head toward the balcony. "The pack. They are gathering." "They know," Kaelin said, stepping up behind her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist. The bond release sent a shockwave through the territory. They know their queen has been chosen. He walked her to the shattered balcony doors. The cold wind rushed in. But Alara didn't shiver. She welcomed it. It felt crisp and invigorating against her heated skin. Kaelin kicked the remaining glass aside and led her out onto the stone terrace overlooking the courtyard. Below, thousands of wolves had gathered, the obsidian shadow pack. Warriors, elders, pups, they stood in the snow, a sea of dark fur and grim faces. They had heard the roar. They had smelled the blood. They were waiting for judgment. When Kaelin stepped into the light, a hush fell over the crowd. He didn't speak immediately. He brought Alara forward, positioning her in front of him, his hands resting possessively on her shoulders. The wind caught her hair, blowing it back from her face. The scent that drifted down to the courtyard was no longer just vanilla and honey. It was changed. It was tempered by the dark, heavy musk of the Alpha King. It no longer smelled like prey. It smelled like power. "Behold!" Kalen's voice boomed, amplified by his alpha command, rolling over the courtyard like thunder. "The runt of Grey Moon is dead." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. "She died in the snow," Kalen continued, his grip on Alara tightening. "She died giving her blood to save your king when he was fallen. She died so that I could live." He looked down at the crowd, his golden eyes blazing. "And from her sacrifice, a queen is risen." He took Alara's left hand, the hand with the scar from the cave, and raised it high. "This is Alara Blackwood," Kalen roared. "She carries my venom in her veins. She carries my life in her hands. Her blood is sacred. Her word is law. Bow to her or answer to me." Silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then, the captain of the guard, the first to recover from the scene in the chamber, dropped to one knee in the snow. "Long live the queen!" he shouted. It was the spark that lit the fire. One by one, then in waves, the thousands of shifters dropped to their knees. Heads bowed, necks bared. A low, unified rumble of submission rose from the courtyard, vibrating through the stone of the balcony and up through the soles of Alara's feet. Alara looked out at the sea of bowed heads. These were the monsters she had feared her entire life. These were the predators who would have hunted her for sport a day ago. Now, they were her subjects. She leaned back against Kalen, feeling the solid wall of his chest, the anchor that held her to the earth. "They aren't bowing to the king," Kalen whispered in her ear, his voice thick with pride. "They are bowing to you, my love, to your courage." Alara lifted her chin. She didn't hide. She didn't flinch. She accepted their submission, not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of a woman who had walked through hell and come out the other side carrying fire. Hours later, the adrenaline had faded into a warm, glowing contentment. The great hall was empty, save for the two of them. Kalen sat on the obsidian throne, a massive seat carved from volcanic glass. But he wasn't sitting alone. He was sprawled comfortably, one leg stretched out, and Alara was curled in his lap, her legs draped over the armrest, her head resting on his shoulder. The court healers had come and gone, marveling at her physiology, confirming what she already felt. The clotting disorder was gone. Her blood was now enriched with alpha markers. She would live a long, healthy life, a life spanning centuries. Beside him, Alara traced the line of the scar on Kalen's jaw. "What will happen to the Grey Moon Pack?" she asked softly. Kalen captured her hand, kissing her fingertips. "They have been dissolved. Their lands are now ours. Those who were cruel to you have been removed. The rest will learn what it means to be part of a true pack, a pack that protects its own." "Removed?" Alara raised an eyebrow. "I am a king, Alara, not a saint," Kalen rumbled, a dark smirk touching his lips. "No one hurts my mate and keeps their head." Alara sighed, snuggling deeper into his embrace. She should be horrified, perhaps, but after a lifetime of fear, the ferocity of his protection felt like the warmest blanket in the world. "I never thought I'd be warm," she whispered, looking at the fire crackling in the hearth. I thought I would die cold in the dead zone. Kalen tightened his arms around her, pulling her so close there was no space left between them. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent that was now his favorite smell in the universe. You warmed the frozen wolf with your body, he murmured against her skin. You gave me everything you had. I will spend the rest of eternity making sure you never feel cold again. Alara closed her eyes. The castle was quiet. The storm outside had broken, leaving a clear, star-filled night. The bleeding runt was gone, a ghost of a memory. In her place sat the eternal queen, safe in the arms of the monster who worshipped her. I know, she whispered. I'm home. Kalen kissed her, deep and slow, sealing the promise. And in the silence of the throne room, two hearts beat as one, loud and strong, defying the winter forever.